There are moments in war when the edge between victory and catastrophe becomes visible only through a lens. When what appears ordinary to the naked eye conceals beneath its surface the machinery of destruction, the calculations of generals, the desperation of nations running out of time. In the winter of 1944, as Europe convulsed under the weight of the largest conflict humanity had ever known, reconnaissance aircraft crisscrossed the skies above, occupied territories with a singular purpose: to see what the enemy did not want seen. The cameras mounted in their bellies were instruments of brutal clarity, each exposure capturing reality in shades of gray that revealed more than the human eye could process in the chaos of battle. 5 cameras per aircraft, synchronized to fire in sequence, covering swaths of terrain 6 miles below, with resolution fine enough to count vehicles, measure shadows, identify the caliber of artillery by the size of shell craters. The pilots who flew these missions did not carry bombs. Their weapon was light itself, captured and fixed onto film, brought back to bases where teams of analysts would spend hours bent over stereoscopes, searching for patterns that might save thousands of lives or doom them. The photograph designated Frame 4024B was unremarkable when it first emerged from the chemical baths in early 1944. Shot from 30,000 feet above the northern French countryside, it showed what reconnaissance photographs always showed: fields divided by hedgerows, dirt roads connecting small villages, the geometric shadows of stone walls and farm buildings. The interpreter who first examined it, a young woman recruited from Oxford trained to identify fortifications and troop movements, saw nothing that warranted closer attention. No gun emplacements, no tank formations, no telltale patterns of recent military construction. The frame was catalogued, assigned a reference number, and filed among thousands of others accumulating in the archives of RAF Medmenham, the nerve center of British photographic intelligence. 85,000 images were processed there daily in the lead-up to D-Day, a tidal wave of information that threatened to overwhelm even the most meticulous analysis. Priority went to immediate tactical threats: the Atlantic Wall fortifications, V-weapon launch sites, radar installations, anything that would face Allied soldiers when they stormed the beaches. Frame 4024B, showing nothing obvious, was deemed low priority. It joined the silent majority of reconnaissance images, seen, assessed, stored, forgotten. But the camera had recorded something the interpreter's eyes could not perceive in that first glance. Something hidden not by camouflage or deception, but by the limitations of human attention under the pressure of an approaching invasion. The photograph waited, patient as stone, holding its secret through the chaos of war and the decades of peace that followed. 60 years later, a historian working on a documentary about Operation Crossbow, the Allied effort to locate and destroy Hitler's V-weapon program, requested access to reconnaissance imagery from the spring of 1944. She was searching for evidence of launch ramps, the distinctive ski-shaped structures that held V-1 rockets before they were fired toward London. The archives delivered hundreds of scans, Frame 4024B among them. She examined each one systematically, using digital tools that allowed her to enhance contrast, adjust brightness, zoom into details that would have been invisible to interpreters working with magnifying glasses in 1944. Most frames showed exactly what they were supposed to show. But Frame 4024B made her pause, not because of what was in the center of the image, the obvious features that drew the eye naturally, but because of what lurked in the periphery. In the lower right corner, barely visible among the shadows of hedgerows, there were marks in the earth. Subtle disturbances that formed geometric patterns too regular to be natural. She zoomed closer. The marks were lines, rectangular outlines, the unmistakable signature of excavation, recent excavation, judging by the sharpness of the edges and the lack of vegetation regrowth, but not bomb craters. These were deliberate, controlled, purposeful. She reached for the adjacent frame from the same reconnaissance flight. Standard practice was for frames to overlap by 60%, allowing stereoscopic analysis. When viewed through the stereoscope, the overlapping images created depth, transforming flat photographs into three-dimensional terrain. And suddenly, what had been ambiguous became clear. The marks were not surface disturbances. They were trenches, freshly dug, carefully arranged in a radial pattern emanating from a central point near the tree line, and covering them, visible now in the stereoscopic view, was camouflage netting, canvas or burlap arranged to mimic the texture of farmland from above, casting shadows at angles that would have seemed natural in a single two-dimensional image but betrayed their artificiality when viewed in 3 dimensions. Her pulse quickened. This was not agricultural work. This was military construction, designed specifically to evade aerial detection. She expanded her search, pulling more frames from the same mission and adjacent flights. The site appeared in multiple images, captured on different dates spanning several weeks. And in those images, a story unfolded frame by frame. In early April, the site had been empty farmland. By mid-April, excavation had begun. By late April, the trenches were complete and a structure had appeared near the tree line. Low, flat-roofed, covered with earth and vegetation to blend with the surrounding landscape. And in a frame from early May, just weeks before D-Day, she saw something that changed everything. A shadow, long and cylindrical, lying near the entrance to the buried structure, too large to be a supply truck, too streamlined to be conventional artillery, and beside it, barely visible in the grainy resolution, human figures working. She printed the sequence and laid the images across her desk in chronological order, watching the site evolve from empty field to concealed installation in the space of 6 weeks. The speed of construction suggested urgency, the sophistication of the camouflage suggested expertise, and the timing, completion just before the Allied invasion, suggested purpose. This was not a storage depot or a supply cache. This was something operational, something intended to be used. She began cross-referencing the location with known German military positions and found something troubling. The site was not near any major fortifications or troop concentrations. It was isolated, deliberately separated from regular Wehrmacht units. This suggested compartmentalization, operational security beyond normal military practice. Whatever had been built here, only specialized personnel had been involved. She consulted weapons historians, specialists in German rocket development. They examined the photographs, measured the dimensions of the shadow in the May image, calculated probable specifications based on the size of the support structures. Their assessment was unanimous. The site matched the configuration of a rocket launch facility, not a V-1 site. Those had distinctive ski ramp structures that were absent here. Not a V-2 site. Those required massive gantries and support equipment. This was something else, something mobile, something designed to be set up, used, and dismantled quickly. A weapon that had been hidden so effectively that the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in history had photographed it repeatedly and never understood what they were seeing. The discovery of what would come to be known as Site 4024 sent ripples through the small community of World War II historians and intelligence analysts. If a major German weapons installation had been constructed in occupied France just weeks before D-Day and escaped detection, what else had been missed? The researcher requested access to classified documents from 1944, invoking Freedom of Information laws that had opened portions of wartime archives to public scrutiny. What emerged from those files was a fragmentary story, pieces of intelligence that had been collected but never assembled into a coherent picture. In March 1944, British signals intelligence at Bletchley Park had intercepted encrypted German communications referencing a program codenamed Adlerschlag, Eagle Strike. The intercepts were fragmentary, decoded sections of longer messages that remained opaque. But the pattern suggested weapons development, something being rushed to completion in northern France. The information had been passed to intelligence analysts, who filed it alongside hundreds of other reports about German defensive preparations. Without context, without confirmation from other sources, it remained just another data point in an ocean of information. The reconnaissance photographs that might have provided that confirmation, Frame 4024B and others like it, were being examined for different purposes by different analysts, using different search criteria. The two streams of intelligence never intersected. A month after the intercepts in April 1944, a French resistance cell near the coast reported unusual German activity to their British handlers via clandestine radio. Wehrmacht engineers and what appeared to be technical specialists from outside the regular military hierarchy had arrived with trucks and excavation equipment. They worked at night under heavy security. threatening local civilians with reprisals if they approached or spoke of what they saw. The resistance reported coordinates, rough descriptions, speculation that it might be a fuel depot or ammunition storage. The report was added to the daily intelligence summary, noted, and filed. There were hundreds of such reports flowing from occupied France as the Germans frantically prepared for the invasion they knew was coming. Each report was evaluated for reliability and urgency. This one, lacking any indication of immediate tactical significance, was graded as low priority. No follow-up reconnaissance was specifically tasked. The standard mission profiles already covered the area. Frame 4024B would be taken weeks later as part of routine surveillance. But no one connected the resistance report with the photographs when they were analyzed. The photograph showed nothing obviously military. The report had been vague, and both were buried in the avalanche of information that characterized intelligence work in the final months before D-Day. By May 1944, fragments of intelligence about Adlerschlag had accumulated in different departments, each piece insufficient on its own to warrant action. The signal's intercept suggested a weapons program. The resistance reports indicated concealed construction. The reconnaissance photographs showed excavation and buried structures. But these fragments lived in separate files, examined by separate analysts working on separate problems. The organizational structure of Allied intelligence, while effective in many ways, created silos that prevented information from flowing freely between departments. Signals intelligence specialists did not routinely communicate with photo interpreters. Resistance liaison officers did not always share raw reports with reconnaissance analysts. Each group was focused on its specific domain, processing vast quantities of information under crushing time pressure. The possibility that a single German program might leave traces across multiple intelligence streams was understood in theory, but difficult to achieve in practice when those streams were separated by bureaucracy, security classifications, and the simple logistics of managing thousands of personnel across multiple locations. And so Adlerschlag remained invisible, not because any individual piece of intelligence was missed, but because the pieces were never brought together into a single picture until decades after the war had ended. The historian's discovery prompted a broader investigation. If Site 4024 had been overlooked, were there others? She assembled a team, archaeologists, image analysts, weapons specialists, and began a systematic review of reconnaissance photography from northern France in the spring of 1944. They developed search algorithms based on the features identified in Frame 4024B, buried structures with flat camouflaged roofs, radial trench systems, recent excavation near natural cover like hedgerows or tree lines. Modern machine learning tools trained on the characteristics of Site 4024 scanned millions of archived images, flagging anything that matched the profile. The computer worked with tireless precision, identifying candidates for human review. Over the course of 18 months, the team examined thousands of flagged images. Most were false positives, natural features, or agricultural patterns that superficially resembled military construction. But 17 were genuine matches. 17 sites scattered along the northern coast of France, each showing the same configuration of buried structures and radial trenches, each constructed in the weeks before D-Day, each photographed multiple times and catalogued as unremarkable. When plotted on a map, the sites formed a defensive arc along the anticipated invasion beaches, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against amphibious landings. It was not a single experimental installation. It was a network, a coordinated deployment of what appeared to be mobile rocket platforms, hidden so effectively that they had remained invisible to Allied intelligence despite being photographed from multiple angles on multiple dates. The implications were staggering. If all 17 sites had been operational on June 6, 1944, if each had been capable of launching even a small number of rockets toward the landing beaches, the casualties could have been catastrophic. The beaches on D-Day were crowded with men and equipment, thousands of soldiers wading through surf toward heavily defended positions. A single rocket striking a landing craft could kill dozens. A coordinated barrage from 17 sites could kill thousands. More than the immediate death toll, the psychological impact would have been devastating. Allied troops had trained for machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Conventional weapons they understood and could take cover from. They had not prepared for guided missiles falling from the sky without warning. The V-1 and V-2 attacks on London had demonstrated the terror of weapons against which there was no defense, the sound of engines cutting out followed by silence, and then obliteration. On an exposed beach under fire with nowhere to hide, that terror could have spread panic through entire divisions. Units could have broken. The carefully choreographed timetable of the invasion could have collapsed into chaos. And yet it had not happened. The rockets, if they existed, had not been fired. The sites had been photographed but not bombed. The invasion had succeeded with losses that, while heavy, were within projected ranges. Why? The answer lay in the intersection of German ambition and German dysfunction, the gap between what the Third Reich planned and what it could actually execute in the final year of a war. It was losing on every front. Archival research revealed that Adlerschlag had been conceived in late 1943 by a team of weapons specialists at Peenemünde, the rocket research facility on the Baltic coast, where the V-2 was being developed. The concept was straightforward. Create a smaller mobile rocket that could be deployed rapidly and concealed easily, avoiding the vulnerability of fixed installations like the massive ski ramps used for V-1 launches. The V-2 required elaborate support infrastructure, gantries, fuel trucks, crews of technicians, making it difficult to hide and slow to redeploy. Adlerschlag was designed to solve those problems. The rockets would be smaller, with ranges sufficient to strike targets in southern England from northern France, but not requiring the complex guidance systems of the V-2. The launch platforms would be buried, camouflaged, virtually invisible from the air. A single site could be constructed in weeks, operated by a small crew, and abandoned after firing. In theory, dozens of such sites could saturate Allied defenses, striking without warning from positions that reconnaissance could not identify. The Peenemünde engineers presented the concept to Wehrmacht command in early 1944, as Allied bombing of V-weapon facilities intensified and German strategic options narrowed. It was approved immediately. Resources were allocated, production was scheduled, and then the machinery of German bureaucracy ground it to pieces. The first problem was production. German industry in 1944 was stretched beyond capacity, struggling to produce tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and the V-2 rockets that Hitler had designated as priority weapons. Adding another rocket program required diverting resources from existing programs, a decision that sparked bureaucratic warfare between competing departments. The Luftwaffe, which controlled V-1 production, opposed anything that might reduce their allocations. The SS, which controlled V-2 production through its slave labor camps, saw Adlerschlag as competition for scarce materials and technical personnel. The Wehrmacht, which would operate the mobile launchers, demanded immediate delivery of hardware that did not yet exist. Meetings were held, memos were written, priorities were debated while weeks slipped past. By the time production actually began, it was late April 1944. The invasion was weeks away. There was no time for testing, no time for the iterative refinement that weapons development normally required. The rockets were manufactured hastily, using simplified designs that sacrificed reliability for speed. Quality control was minimal. Many units left the factory with defects that would have made them dangerous to fire even if they had reached the launch sites. The second problem was logistics. Moving the rockets from factories in Germany to launch sites in France required secure transport through a rail network that was disintegrating under Allied bombing. Every bridge, every marshalling yard, every stretch of track was a target. Trains carrying Adlerschlag components were delayed, rerouted, sometimes destroyed before reaching their destinations. Security was another challenge. The program was classified at the highest levels, known only to select officers and technical personnel. But maintaining secrecy while moving large quantities of specialized equipment through occupied territory proved nearly impossible. Rumors spread. Resistance networks noticed unusual shipments and reported them to London. The more the Germans tried to hide Adlerschlag, the more attention it attracted from intelligence services that were already monitoring V-weapon activities with obsessive focus. Some shipments were intercepted by resistance saboteurs who did not know what they were destroying, but recognized anything military as a legitimate target. Other shipments reached their destinations only to discover that the launch sites were not ready, construction delayed by shortages of concrete, by Allied air raids that forced work to stop. by the simple chaos of an occupation beginning to crumble as German forces prepared for inevitable invasion. The third problem was personnel. Operating the Adlerschlag launchers required technical expertise beyond what ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers possessed. Crews needed training in rocket assembly, fuel handling, launch procedures, skills that took months to develop properly. But there were no months. The engineers and technicians who understood the systems were desperately needed at Peenemünde and the V2 production facilities. They could not be spared for deployment to France. The Wehrmacht tried to compensate by sending soldiers for abbreviated training courses, crash programs that taught basic procedures without conveying real understanding. It was not enough. When the first Adlerschlag units finally reached the launch sites in late May 1944, the crews struggled with equipment they barely understood. Practice launches were attempted. Most failed. Rockets that would not ignite, guidance systems that malfunctioned, structural failures that caused missiles to disintegrate seconds after leaving their launchers. The few successful launches demonstrated that the concept could work, but they also revealed how far Adlerschlag remained from operational readiness. The mobile launchers were not mobile enough. Repositioning them after firing proved more difficult than anticipated. The rockets were not reliable enough. Failure rates exceeded 50%. And time, the scarcest resource of all, had run out. On the morning of June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the 17 Adlerschlag sites were not operational. Some had received rockets but no trained crews. Others had crews but no rockets. A few had both but lacked the fuel or electrical systems needed for launch. The most advanced site, Site 4024, captured in Frame 4024B, had attempted to fire a test launch 3 days before D-Day and suffered a catastrophic failure when the rocket exploded during ignition, killing 2 technicians and destroying the primary launcher. German commanders, recognizing that the invasion was imminent and that Adlerschlag would not be ready in time, made a decision. Rather than allow the sites to be captured intact, providing the Allies with intelligence about German rocket capabilities, they ordered immediate demolition. Specialized demolition teams moved from site to site, removing equipment, destroying launch structures, filling trenches, leaving behind only scorched earth and fragments too damaged to be useful. The work was done hastily, under pressure from advancing Allied forces, but it was thorough enough that when British and American intelligence officers arrived to inspect the sites in late June, they found almost nothing. Some concrete foundations, disturbed earth, local civilians who reported German activity but could provide few specific details. Without rockets, without documentation, without intact hardware, the intelligence officers concluded they were looking at decoys or abandoned supply depots. The sites were noted in reports and forgotten, overshadowed by more pressing concerns as the Allies pushed inland toward Paris. But the photographs remembered. Frame 4024B and thousands of others like it had recorded the sites at the height of their construction, capturing details that would not exist after the demolition teams finished their work. The trenches, the buried structures, the shadows of equipment and personnel, all preserved in silver halide waiting in archives while the world moved on. The veterans who had fought in Normandy grew old. The analysts who had examined the photographs during the war retired, carrying memories that faded as memory does. The physical evidence disappeared, plowed under by farmers reclaiming their fields, buried beneath roads and housing developments as France rebuilt. But the photographs remained unchanged, immune to time, holding knowledge that no one thought to seek until technology and curiosity converged in the early 2000s. The historian who discovered Site 4024 had access to tools that did not exist in 1944. Digital scanning, image enhancement, machine learning algorithms capable of detecting patterns invisible to human eyes. More importantly, she had time. The pressure that had driven photo interpreters in 1944, the need to process thousands of images daily searching for immediate threats, no longer constrained her work. She could examine frame 4024B for hours, returning to it again and again, bringing colleagues to review her findings, building a case through patient accumulation of evidence. She could connect dots that wartime analysts, working in isolation under operational security restrictions, had never had the opportunity to connect. Her published findings on Adlerschlag generated intense debate in military history circles. Some historians embraced the research, viewing it as an important contribution to understanding German weapons development and the limits of Allied intelligence. Others remained skeptical, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that the sites could have been decoys or facilities for conventional weapons that had been misidentified. The debate was methodologically complex and, in academic terms, vigorous. But beneath the scholarly arguments lay a more fundamental question. What does it mean to discover something that was photographed 80 years ago but not understood until now? Had Adlerschlag been invisible or merely overlooked? Was this a failure of intelligence or simply the inevitable limitation of human perception when confronted with vast quantities of information and finite time to process it? The photo interpreters at RAF Medmenham had been brilliant, their work essential to Allied victory. They had identified 96 V-1 launch sites through painstaking stereoscopic analysis. They had mapped the entire Atlantic Wall, providing detailed intelligence that saved thousands of lives on D-Day. They had worked 18-hour shifts, eyes burning from hours at stereoscopes, processing 85,000 images daily at peak operational tempo. To suggest they had missed Adlerschlag seemed to diminish that extraordinary achievement. Yet the photographs proved that the sites had existed, had been constructed precisely when and where the historian claimed, had been sophisticated enough to evade detection by the most advanced reconnaissance system in the world at that time. The resolution to this apparent contradiction lay in understanding the nature of observation itself. Seeing is not a passive process of recording what exists, but an active process of selecting what matters from an overwhelming field of potential information. The human eye receives millions of data points every second: colors, shapes, movements, textures. The brain filters this flood ruthlessly, discarding the vast majority and elevating only what seems relevant to survival, to goals, to the task at hand. Attention is the spotlight we shine on reality, illuminating some things while leaving others in shadow. The photo interpreters at RAF Medmenham were trained to look for specific threats: fortifications, troop movements, radar installations, V-weapon sites with known characteristics. They saw those things with remarkable precision. But Adlerschlag did not fit the known profiles. Its mobile launchers did not look like ski ramps. Its buried structures did not match the architecture of V-2 facilities. And so they were filtered out, categorized as probably agricultural or possibly minor supply depots, deemed insufficiently significant to warrant detailed analysis when time was scarce and priorities were clear. The photograph saw everything. The camera does not filter, does not prioritize, does not decide what matters. It captures light indiscriminately. But humans looking at photographs must filter, must decide where to direct attention, must make judgments about significance based on incomplete knowledge and urgent deadlines. And in that gap between what the camera records and what the viewer perceives, secrets hide. The discovery of Adlerschlag prompted a broader initiative to re-examine World War II reconnaissance photography using modern analytical tools. The project, designated Operation Hindsight, sought to digitize and systematically review the 10 million photographs stored in archives in Edinburgh, London, and Washington. Machine learning algorithms were trained to identify features of interest, not just the obvious fortifications and military installations, but subtle patterns that might indicate concealed facilities or deception operations. The algorithms were fed thousands of verified examples, known V-weapon sites, radar installations, camouflaged airfields. They learned the visual signatures of military construction, the telltale shadows and geometries that distinguished purpose-built structures from natural landscape. Then they were unleashed on the archives, scanning millions of images, flagging thousands of candidates for human review. The project took 5 years and involved researchers from dozens of institutions. What they found reshaped understanding of the secret warfare that had raged beneath the surface of the visible conflict. Beyond the 17 Adlerschlag sites, Operation Hindsight identified 63 additional installations across occupied Europe that had been photographed but not recognized during the war. Some were weapons facilities, experimental platforms for aircraft, submarines, rockets. Others were command centers, buried so deeply and camouflaged so effectively that they had functioned throughout the war without being targeted. Still others remained mysteries. Structures that clearly served military purposes, but whose specific functions could not be determined even with decades of hindsight and unlimited analysis time. One discovery particularly captured public imagination: a hidden airfield in Poland, photographed 11 times between 1943 and 1945, that had never appeared in Allied intelligence assessments. The airfield had been built inside a forest, with trees left standing between runways to break up the geometric patterns that made airfields easy to identify from above. Aircraft were sheltered beneath camouflage netting strung between trees, invisible unless the sun angle and shadows were precisely right. On most reconnaissance passes, the cameras saw only forest. But in one image from November 1944, taken at dawn when shadows were long and the low sun illuminated textures differently than midday photography, the runways became briefly visible, straight lines cutting through trees, too straight and too wide to be natural fire breaks or logging roads. The photo interpreter in 1944 had noted the anomaly, but categorized it as low priority, possibly an abandoned construction project. Modern analysis revealed that the airfield had been continuously active, serving as a test facility for experimental jets that Germany was developing in desperation as Allied air superiority strangled conventional Luftwaffe operations. The jets had been photographed too, small dark shapes visible in a few frames, but misidentified as trucks or supply vehicles, because no one expected to see aircraft parked in the middle of a forest. Each discovery told a similar story: German ingenuity in concealment meeting Allied thoroughness in reconnaissance, with the camera capturing everything but human perception, filtering out what did not match expectations. This was not failure. This was the inevitable friction of intelligence work, the gap between theoretically perfect knowledge and practically achievable understanding. But the discoveries also revealed how much had been preserved in the photographs, waiting for technology and time to reveal it. In the 1990s and 2000s, as digital scanning made high-resolution copies of wartime photographs widely available, amateur historians began conducting their own analyses. Retired intelligence officers reviewed missions they had worked on 60 years earlier, seeing details they had missed when younger. Military enthusiasts created online databases, crowdsourcing the identification of vehicles, equipment, and installations across thousands of images. Slowly, painstakingly, the hidden dimensions of the Second World War came into focus, not through new information but through new ways of seeing old information. The photographs had been there all along. The knowledge had been there all along. What changed was the ability to extract it, to connect it, to understand its significance beyond the immediate tactical concerns that had driven wartime analysis. The historian who discovered Site 4024 often reflected on what her work meant. She had not uncovered new facts exactly. The photographs had always existed in archives accessible to researchers. What she had done was ask questions those photographs could answer, questions that no one had thought to ask while the veterans were still alive and the war was still within living memory. Why had no one looked earlier? Partly because the tools had not existed. Digital enhancement and machine learning made analysis possible that would have taken lifetimes using manual methods. Partly because the documents had been classified. Much of the intelligence background on German weapons programs remained restricted until the 1990s. But mostly because no one had imagined there was anything left to find. The Second World War was the most documented conflict in history, studied exhaustively by generations of historians. The major battles, the key decisions, the turning points, all had been analyzed from every conceivable angle. It seemed that everything worth knowing was already known. Frame 4024b proved otherwise. It demonstrated that even the most thoroughly examined events still contained secrets, still offered insights that careful attention could extract. The photograph had been seen but not perceived, recorded but not understood. For 60 years it had waited, a frozen moment of spring light over occupied France, holding evidence of a plan that almost came to fruition and almost changed history, until someone finally looked closely enough to see what had always been there. The legacy of Frame 4024b extends beyond historical curiosity. In an era of total surveillance where satellites and drones capture billions of images annually, the lesson remains urgently relevant. Collection is not the same as analysis, and analysis is not the same as understanding. Modern intelligence agencies face challenges that dwarf what RAF Medmenham confronted in 1944. The volume of imagery is exponentially larger. The need to process it in near real time is more acute. And adversaries have studied the history of reconnaissance, learning from German successes and failures in concealment, developing techniques specifically designed to evade detection by algorithms and human analysts alike. Somewhere in the vast databases of contemporary intelligence, there are almost certainly images like Frame 4024B, photographs that have been collected, catalogued, and filed, that show threats not yet recognized because they do not match known patterns, because the questions that would reveal their significance have not yet been asked. This is not a failure of technology or personnel. It is a fundamental limitation of intelligence work, in a world where information vastly exceeds the capacity to process it. The only defense is humility, recognizing that today's low-priority image might be tomorrow's critical intelligence, and that the absence of detected threats does not mean the absence of threats. The Adlerschlag program, had it succeeded, would not have changed the outcome of World War II. By June 1944, Germany was losing on every front, its resources depleted, its strategic position untenable. Even a successful rocket campaign against the D-Day beaches would have delayed, rather than prevented, the liberation of Europe. But delay can matter immensely in war. Weeks of additional fighting could have meant thousands of additional casualties. It could have altered the political calculus of the post-war settlement, changed which forces occupied which territories when the Reich finally collapsed. History turns on smaller margins than we often acknowledge. And that ultimately is why photographs like Frame 4024B matter. Not because they reveal game-changing secrets, but because they remind us that game-changing secrets exist, that they can be hidden not in vaults or codes, but in plain sight, and that the difference between seeing and not seeing can be measured in lives. The pilot who flew the reconnaissance mission in spring 1944, whose name has been lost to records, captured something he did not know he was capturing. The interpreter who first examined the frame saw nothing worth noting. For 60 years, the photograph existed in a state of latent significance, waiting for context that would transform it from unremarkable terrain documentation into evidence of a secret weapon program. When that transformation finally occurred, it was not because the photograph changed. It was because the world around it changed, the tools available for analysis, the questions being asked, the freedom to access previously classified context. And in that transformation lies a profound insight about the nature of evidence and understanding. Reality does not announce its own significance. A photograph is just light captured on a substrate, patterns of silver or pixels that require interpretation to become knowledge. The same image can be simultaneously meaningless and crucial, depending on who views it and what they bring to the viewing. Frame 4024B was both for 60 years, meaningless to those who saw it without context, crucial to those who eventually understood what they were seeing. This duality is uncomfortable for intelligence professionals trained to believe that good analysis should extract all significant information from available data, but it is inescapable. No amount of skill or attention can overcome the fundamental problem that you must know what you are looking for in order to find it. And breakthrough discoveries often come from recognizing patterns that existing knowledge did not predict. The photo interpreters at RAF Medmenham were not failing when they catalogued Frame 4024B as unremarkable. They were doing their jobs with extraordinary skill under impossible constraints. The failure, if there was one, was systemic. Organizational structures that prevented information sharing, security classifications that siloed knowledge, and the relentless pressure of wartime urgency that forced prioritization of immediate tactical threats over longer-term strategic mysteries. The historian who discovered Site 4024 eventually traveled to the location in France, standing in the field that had once held buried rockets and camouflaged launch positions. The farmer who owned the land had no idea his property had been the subject of academic papers and intelligence reviews. His grandfather had mentioned Germans working there during the war, but he had assumed it was a supply depot or fuel storage, something mundane. When shown the photographs and told what they revealed, he was stunned. For 70 years he had been plowing over a secret, turning soil that covered the foundations of a weapon designed to kill thousands. The concrete fragments his tractor occasionally unearthed. He had assumed they were from destroyed farm buildings, casualties of the German retreat. The idea that they might be remnants of rocket launch infrastructure had never occurred to him. Why would it? The site was farmland. It had been farmland before the war. It had returned to farmland after the war, and nothing in its appearance suggested it had ever been anything else. That was the point, of course. That was why Adlerschlag had worked as concealment even while failing as a weapons program. The sites were designed to disappear back into the landscape, leaving no trace that casual observation would notice. Only the photographs preserved evidence of what had briefly existed there, and even the photographs required specialized knowledge and tools to interpret correctly. Standing in that field, looking at landscape that appeared entirely ordinary, the historian understood something about the nature of history itself. The past does not survive intact. It survives in fragments, documents, artifacts, memories, and photographs that must be interpreted, contextualized, understood through frameworks that shape what we can see. The same fragment can yield different insights depending on when and how it is examined, what questions drive the examination, what technologies enable the analysis. Frame 4024B had existed for 60 years before revealing its secret, not because the secret was hidden within the photograph, but because the context needed to extract it had not yet been assembled. And there are undoubtedly other photographs, other documents, other fragments waiting in archives around the world, holding knowledge that current questions do not access and current tools cannot extract. Future historians will look at the materials available today and wonder how their predecessors missed things that seem obvious in retrospect. That is the nature of knowledge. It is never complete, never final, always open to revision by new perspectives and new methodologies. The photograph waits with infinite patience, holding its moment of frozen light, ready to reveal whatever the viewer has learned to see. Frame 4024B waited 60 years. Other photographs may wait longer, but they will wait because unlike memory, unlike testimony, unlike the physical artifacts that decay and disappear, the photograph endures. Light captured once continues to illuminate, across decades, across generations, across the vast distance between the moment when the shutter opened and the moment when understanding finally arrives.